Right. Another big question, or not really big question, but kind of what I've been thinking is so kind of like a debate for Mormonism is like, okay, we had prophets back then. Why would God stop using prophets today? Which I'm like, kind of like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But at the same time, I feel like back then prophets were like came from the lowest of the lowest, right? And then many of them were stoned, not listened to, right? And so that's kind of how prophets, arose from back then. But the prophets today in the LDS church, they're at the top of the church, and they like rise up through seniority to become a prophet. It's much different than back then, how you have like some crazy person like saying
Yeah.
God is you know I don't know, you have like
No, no, yeah, yeah, I get what you're
yeah
saying. So, well, first of all, that's
like
not the
John the
story of Joseph
Baptist. He's
Smith.
like,
Yeah, that's not the story of Joseph Smith. The story of Joseph Smith and the story of John the Baptist
well,
could be very, very close. In fact, the story of
yeah,
Joseph and
well,
Jesus could be very close.
real quick, I'm not saying like Joseph Smith. I'm
No,
saying
you're
like
talking about today. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Nelson. Yeah.
Well, and I'll explain why that is. So,
Okay.
Joseph Smith used to say that the church was restored for the last time. It will never again be taken from the earth. People say, well, how did the church fall into apostasy in the first century or after the first century?
Hmm.
Well, it fell into the apostasy very simply. In fact, a lot of Latter-day Saints will answer the question of the apostasy by pointing to the fact that the apostles were killed and their authority was taken from the earth. While that is true, I do not believe that that's a very good argument because there's no way to prove that their authority was taken from the earth because we have the church fathers and the writings of those who followed the apostles. I truly believe that these men were inspired. I think that they were devoted. I think that they were good Christians. I think that they were absolutely believing that they were following Christ and receiving revelation. The problem with it is that gradually they stopped believing that. What they did is they started vesting authority in the scriptures. They stopped receiving revelation. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church has an official position that was identified in Vatican II that there is no more public revelation after the time of the apostles. The Protestants in the 16th century, late 1500s, early 1600s, believed that there was no more revelation because the Bible alone is God's word. So the apostasy is simply the rejection of God speaking, which you, of course, it seems like you understand that position and would agree to some degree that that's correct. So your question there is that how are the apostles today so different in the sense that they are normal in society, they're taken care of, they're kind of at the echelons of society, whereas the apostles like
Yeah.
Peter, James, and John's underwent persecution. Well, the reason that Joseph Smith went through what he went through, which he eventually was martyred, he never had an easy go of it, right? He was an uneducated farm boy who eventually rose to lead a large group. Estimates are there were between 20 and 30,000 members of the church at the time he was martyred. It's a pretty good group for
Yeah.
19th century America. Um, Even the Nauvoo Legion was 5,000, which was almost the size of the standing U.S. military. So if Joseph Smith wanted to be protected by the saints, he very well could have said, you know what, screw this. Everybody go get your guns. We're done. We're not putting up with this anymore. We're just going to slaughter everybody. So he could have done that, but instead he told them to keep their guns at home and that he would just go die. So, and that's that's actually just what the records reflect. Now, that's very different from the what we see happening as the century turns into the 20th century. The answer to your question is actually very simple because the United States actually started to fulfill its promise. There are promises in the Constitution. And if you study the life of Joseph Smith actually went back to Washington, D.C. more than once to advocate for government involvement in helping to stop the persecutions of the Latter day Saints. And he was met with basically, we can't help you. they refused to help the Mormons. And so they allowed local governments to persecute the Latter-day Saints and cause them to be moved and have their property stolen. Well, what happened is as they moved into Utah territory, so what happened is the Latter-day Saints actually, by moving into Utah territory, left the country. They realized that they had no protections under the Constitution, and it was better to move to Mexico because that's where Utah was. Utah was basically Mexico. They left and went into foreign lands to get away from the United States, even though they were supposed to have been guaranteed a freedom of religion under the First Amendment. They were not fulfilling their responsibility and their oath. Well, what happened is as the country spread under the Western expansion, and we became what we know today as the United States, the federal government actually started to enforce the law and actually start to protect people's religious rights. So the idea that the apostles today would be persecuted or stoned in the way that we see them done in the first century or even back to the time of Joseph Smith would actually be impossible because modern civilization and modern society and law enforcement would prevent that from happening. So President Nelson is not in any great danger visiting any congregation or any group because it's not like people can mob or lynch the Latter-day Saints because it would be illegal. In fact, they'd call in police and law enforcement to stop that. So people just don't bother with that kind of behavior. Plus, we're all trying to be a little bit more civil today than we were then. But as far as them being from the upper echelons of society, that was always a push that people would become educated. Now, the apostles are not selected based on nepotism like they used to be. So it used to be that in order for, and just as a practical matter, because the problem with it is a lot of these are very practical matters. Who did Jesus choose as his apostles?
Chose a fisher, tax collector,
He chose a
and
fisherman. He chose a fisherman
hmm,
and that fisherman's friends and that fisherman's friends' brothers.
yeah,
And then he chose another set of brothers who knew another guy. And then he picked a tax collector who was wealthy, right? So he's not just randomly selecting poor people. He's selecting people from different walks of life. He's picking people from other, there's in fact, there's one of them is Simon the Zealot, and he was probably a member of the precursor of what became known as the Zealots, who were a religious group that was very against Roman occupation. They were very politically active against Rome. And Jesus chooses one of those. Matthew, if it was Matthew Levi, he was a tax collector. He's a publican. He actually would have been a high member of society in the sense that he would be protected by the government. Now, the people wouldn't have liked him very much, but he would have had a position with the government. But Peter was not poor. Peter was probably a very prosperous fisherman and well known and well respected. He probably had a business, a thriving business. And so they're not exactly the dregs of society. And they were educated in the sense that they knew the scriptures. So if they knew the scriptures and they were educated according to Jewish tradition, they had some degree of access to literacy. They were probably all literate. And so it's not that they were, because the majority of people at this time were illiterate. It's just that the definition of literacy 2,000 years ago, as opposed to the definition of literacy today, is very different. The other thing too is by today's standards and those standards, to find somebody who would be comparable to the way the apostles were in the first century or even in the 19th century, you would almost have to scour a third world country for people who would fit those socioeconomic and educational uh, 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 positions. Because if you go down to, even to some developing nations, you would find people who are pretty well educated. They're literate and they're able to read and write and things like that. So what happens is that similarly, when Joseph Smith established the church, he picked the people who actually were closely associated with him because they were the best people. You're going to pick somebody who knows you and is loyal. And so you can't pick people you don't know, right? And so out of the people
Yeah.
he knew, he selected people. And some of them were related to him, like his brother Hiram. His brother Hiram served with him as an apostle in the first presidency because he trusted his brother. Jesus's brother, James, and Jude also were leaders in the church and selected as leaders in the church because they were his brothers. So Jesus imparted responsibilities to his own family members as well. Now, initially they rejected him, but gradually, as they came to become believers, they became leaders in the church. So the James who was the head of the Jerusalem church, the bishop of the Jerusalem church, that James was Jesus's brother and was probably converted as a consequence of seeing his brother resurrected. Because in Matthew and Mark, we learn that he actually had rejected his brother's calling. He didn't believe in him. Whereas Joseph Smith, even from the beginning, was universally believed by his family that he actually was having the experiences he was having. Now, today, we have people who serve in the church. They serve in callings of bishops and stake presidents, etc. As they do so, the church kind of monitors them. So, um, and they take note of them, and then they watch them, and then they select them based on worthiness. It's not necessarily based on any socioeconomic position. It is convenient to take people who have means because then you know that they are financially responsible and they are not going to be dependent on the church. And the church can use tithing records to establish those kinds of things. But here's the issue, and this is a common claim against the apostles, that they lead the church for money or something like that, which is kind of usually the underlying concern with this kind of a question, is that these men are becoming leaders in the church for purposes of position and money. The difficulty with that is this. If they were to call me today and ask me to be an apostle, it would be a pretty big pay cut for me. I actually don't think I could afford it because I would have to quit my job to go work for the church and I would receive a stipend. I would be paid, but I would receive a significantly smaller amount of money than I currently make. The problem with it is that all these men who serve as general authorities and leaders in the church have all done the same. They've given up
Hmm.
lucrative careers during some of the most productive years of their life in order to receive what actually amounts to a relatively small stipend. I
Mm.
think it's about 150,000 a year or something like that. That's nothing by comparison to the fact that so at 59 years old, our current prophet, President Nelson, at 59 years
Is that
old,
heart surgery?
he retired as a cardiothoracic surgeon. Now,
Mhm.
cardiothoracic surgeons today make about $1 million a year.
Wow.
He's not paid $1 million a year. He's not paid anything like $1 million a year.
Yeah.
These men are, I mean, Elder Bednar, for example. Elder Bednar actually worked for Walmart and he was a professor at the University of Arkansas. And he taught organizational behavior. And one of the things that he did is as he worked for Walmart, he toured the different Walmart stores with Sam Walton, who started Walmart. And he would help Sam Walton develop all of the systems for efficiency in the Walmart stores by going around to the stores. And I wonder, in the process of developing all of the employee training and all of the systems that are utilized by Walmart for efficiency, do you think that the person who did that was paid well? Probably yes,
Hmm.
right? So these people worked in industries and they were actually very successful, but they were also incredibly devoted as members of the church. So not only were they serving in their capacities in their professions, but they were also serving as stake presidents, as bishops, as elders quorum presidents, as Sunday school teachers. They were full tithe payers and they were devoted and dedicated to the church. They weren't they weren't doing that in the hopes that someday they could become an apostle because nobody knows who's going to become an apostle,
Hmm.
right? And so it's not like you can plan. Like I couldn't say, I want to be an apostle, and then there's some career path that leads me to become an apostle.
Hmm.
I know people who actually have tried to move up to Salt Lake and suck up to leaders of the church for the purposes of eventually getting placed as a member of the 70 or as eventually an apostle. And you know what? It doesn't work
Hmm.
because their heart is not in the right place. And it
Yeah.
takes a tremendous amount of sacrifice to do what those guys do. I wouldn't wish being an apostle on anybody. It is not a life I would want to live. It's
Yeah.
incredibly stressful, and there's not a financial reward for it that's consistent with what you do. And I think that people out of the church are, in fact, there's a meme that went around that's really funny that's it's just they took a picture of Joseph Smith. It's a painting of Joseph Smith talking to the apostles of his day. And it's kind of a parody because it has Joseph Smith basically talking about the church in the sense that he's like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start this organization and we're going to build up a big tithing bank and we're going to plan it so that hundreds of years after we're all dead, it's a multi-billion-dollar company.
Right. Yeah. That's
And
so
and
true
it goes
because
to each of the guys going, "What? How does that benefit us today?" Oh, but it'll be great in 200 years from now when it's a massive
yeah.
global enterprise, right? And he's
Right.
like,
Like he
"But
got
what
no
are we going to do
reward.
now?" Yeah, but it's like, "What are we going to do now?" Well, now we're going to get persecuted, give everything we have to it, spend years in foreign countries trying to convince people to join the group. We're all going to have multiple people die and watch our families suffer and struggle. But eventually, the church will be a multi-billion-dollar empire.
That's funny,
So it's
actually.
like
Yeah,
it's just like it's funny. It's funny. And then what we'll do is we'll spend billions of dollars building temples all across the world that we'll never sell. We'll just keep them in perpetuity, pay the property taxes on them, pay all the cost of upkeep and maintenance and remodeling and power bills. We'll do all that and we'll just hold on to these things.
right.
And
Yeah.
all of them, and then it shows. It's funny because it flips to a picture of Brigham Young and he goes, "Based."
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I
it's
can
a
see it.
hilarious meme,
But
but yeah,
yeah,
it's just like
because I right.
they. Well,
Wait, go on. Yeah.
my point is they believe that what they're doing is what they're claiming it is. That doesn't mean they're right, but these are people who believe what they're saying. They are not nefarious motives. I've actually met, in fact, currently I've met of the living apostles all but five. And
Wow.
a lot, well, and a lot of them actually, like um, Elder Anderson, Elder Uchtdorf, Elder Holland, Elder Eyring. I met most of them when I was serving as a missionary because a lot of the men that are currently Rasband, a lot of these people, they were in the 70 when I was a missionary. And they were brand new members of the 70. And so they were on assignments to visit different missions. I lived in Utah. I went to
Hmm.
the University of Utah for a while, and so I met several of them up there. Um, they're not what I mean. This whole idea of these guys are money grubbing dudes trying to just make money, that just doesn't fit because they're just not that. It just
Hmm.
it is so antithetical to who they are as people that it just makes no sense. These guys are
Hmm.
concerned with the growth of the church. They're concerned with the youth of the church. They want to make sure that the missionary program is robust. They want to make sure that missionaries maintain their testimonies, that they come home, they get married, they serve productive lives, they pursue education. That's their goal. And all the money and resources of the church are spent in teaching the principles that help people to do that. And these men, if they're rich, they've made their fortunes before they were ever called these callings. And so money is just not a concern for them. It's just I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's one of the because if you look at like, okay, if Mormonism isn't true, why would Joseph Smith do this? So like they look at like, okay, like their motives like money,
Money and women, man. Money and women.
sex, power, and it's like, well, he he wasn't. He was poor his whole life, right? What was he? Because some people say that
So,
you did it
so
for the
he,
money.
no, no. So he had developed, it's not true that he was poor. The last about probably 4 or 5 years of his life were spent in relative peace aside from the court cases. So he was constantly being accused of things and there were attempts to extradite him. So he was fighting legal battles. But here's the thing about Joseph Smith. The last half dozen years of his life, he was the mayor, he was the justice of the court, he was the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, he was the prophet, he was the ecclesiastical leader. So he was the head of the town council. He was also a person who ran a small business in Nauvoo. So between all of those jobs, he also spent time with his own family and children. So the guy was always busy. It's not like he had time to really like lay around and
Hmm.
sit on his butt because he
Yeah.
he basically developed a life of work, and that's all he did was work. Constantly in meetings, constantly doing things. But what's really funny is I have a friend named Don Bradley who's a church historian.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the
I
things, yeah, so Don's
yeah.
got
Go.
a great testimony. If you've ever heard Don, what's great about him is that he left the church for about a half a
Hmm.
dozen years or so, and
Yeah.
he found his way back. And he found his way back actually because he believed that Joseph Smith was a fraud, but he was a sincere fraud or he was a con man or whatever. And what he found was the problem is the more he learned about Joseph Smith, the more he couldn't reconcile the idea that Joseph Smith was a con man with what he was doing because the things he was doing were not
Exactly. Yeah.
consistent with what con men do. Con men don't sacrifice their time for other people. Con men don't disadvantage themselves for the sake of a group. They take advantage of the group. So he was constantly doing things that were causing him problems in order to alleviate the problems of other people. And that's just not consistent with a con man. So, like, if I was a lecherous con man, when I was accused of, he was accused of treason after the city council ordered the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor, which is ultimately what got him arrested the final time in Carthage. Um, they believed that they had the legal authority to destroy the press, and actually, under the time, they probably did, but it probably wasn't a wise thing to do. Joseph Smith was running for
Hmm.
president. Why was Joseph Smith running for president? Not because he wanted to be president so bad. Joseph Smith was running for president because the president was not uh, upholding the law and protecting the Latter-day Saints. And as president, he could actually have control of the federal government so that he could actually reinforce our right to worship according to our own consciences. That was one of his primary things is he says, look, the government's corrupt. It's not protecting its people in our religious worship. That was one of his platform positions. He
Hmm.
also believed that in order to avoid a civil war, which he believed was on the horizon, that we should do something about the issue of slavery. And his position was is that we should raise taxes and we should purchase the slaves and then free them. Because under
Oh.
And so his thing was under the Fifth Amendment, we could go in and do a taking and we could take them and then we could do just compensation the same way that they do eminent domain. Because the slaves are property. We could buy them from their masters and then the federal government has the right to free them.
Hmm.
That's how he felt we could avoid war. And so those were his some of his platform positions. Those don't sound like the platform positions of a con man, right?
Hmm.
That doesn't sound
Yeah.
like somebody who's like, oh, it wasn't like, I want to be, the ruler emperor. In the process of doing that, it put him in a public position where he was a front facing person, and that actually increased the persecution as soon as he said he was running for president. The issue with it is that the animosity towards the Latter-day Saints increased because, like some people who we would seem have a very low chance of winning the presidency, he was actually a pretty popular candidate in 1844. There was
Mhm.
a good chance he could have
Wait,
won the
are you
presidency.
serious? Well, I
Yeah.
how so
So
if everyone how
it
so
wasn't
if everyone
everybody. It
hated
was
him?
so a lot of the animosity was local. And it was mostly geared toward the fact that the Latter-day Saints weren't abolitionists necessarily. They were anti-slavery, and that's different. So we don't
Mhm.
believe in slavery. And so we're not saying go free the slaves. We're saying we don't want to increase the spread of slavery. So in Missouri and other areas, the question of slavery was unsettled. In fact, the states were left where they could decide themselves and vote on it. And so they decided that the Missouri question of slavery, that's why they were kicked out, because the Latter-day Saints were anti-slavery. It's one of the reasons. And as a huge voting bloc who opposed slavery in a state where there were slaves, having a large group that was going to vote against slavery was dangerous. So let's get them out of here and let's kick them into Illinois. So then they go into Illinois and they set up Nauvoo, right? And then they start the city. And every time they go somewhere, they purchase swampland or crapland that nobody wants. And within a few years, they have a thriving city of people, and more people are moving into it and moving into it. And they're Mormons. And guess what? They're all going to vote alike. And that is dangerous politically.
Mhm.
So this group of people keeps making everything they go to flourish and grow and become prosperous because they're industrious, they work hard, they are living very strict Christian principles. They are sharing their wealth with each other. They're living what they call consecration, where they're sharing, they donate, they dedicate things. So whenever they want to build a building, the whole city gets together, raises money and builds it. It's very, very unusual rather than relying on the government to do it. Instead, the Latter-day Saints have to raise their own money to build anything that they want. So the people are very invested in the buildings because they all own them. And Joseph Smith is placed in charge because obviously he's the prophet and God's talking to him. So they have this idea of he's becoming a little king. People think that he's like wielding enormous power. And it seems like his group is growing, and that's dangerous for us. So the political opposition was more local for people who could see it. But countrywide, his platform was more of one of he's addressing the actual political issues of his day, namely things like slavery. Slavery was a huge question, and he had what looked like a very good solution to it. The federal government will buy the slaves and free them. I understand that the loss of the slaves is a huge economic burden in the South. You can't just give up your property, right? That's not right. So we'll just purchase them. Some people thought that that was immoral because you're admitting that the slaves are property rather than people. But in order to avoid war, we just say, look, we just compensate people for what they've got invested in what they've got. And then we can free the slaves. The slave question's over and war is avoided. Because he did prognosticate that war would start in South Carolina, starting over the issue of slavery. He had actually prophesied that that would happen. Of course, it did. So the issue with it is Joseph Smith had lots of layers. He wasn't just some simplistic person that people think he was. This idea that he could have just been a simple con man. Do you think you think he could con thousands and thousands of people who met with him day after day after day and who wrote in their journals and loved
Mhm.
him and cried about him, and yet he was some con man? The group continues to grow, and yet he's a charlatan who's what stealing their money. As far as him being wealthy, yes, they built the mansion house, but remember, he lived in the mansion house because he had other governmental roles, but he also owned the mansion house. In fact, there was a dispute after his death between Emma and the church, which actually is probably what caused her to eventually stay behind, is this idea that does Joseph own the mansion house or does the church?
Yeah, I remember watching a video on that.
And so they
Um,
eventually decided to let Emma keep it. Basically, you know what? She suffered enough. And I don't think people
mhm.
realize Emma didn't just lose Joseph. And I think people think she lost her husband. She didn't just lose Joseph.
Oh,
She lost Hiram because his two
and like have her
brothers,
kids, right?
Yeah, well, she had lost lots of kids, but I'm just saying when Joseph was killed, Hiram was killed with her. And as a consequence of what happened, their brother died a week later.
Hmm.
He got sick because he was chased by
Hmm.
the mob and he got sick and actually died about a week later. So three of
Hmm.
the Smith boys died within a week, and they were her brother-in-laws. Hiram was a great guy. These were people who had been devoted to helping and supporting Joseph and his wife for decades. And yet they all three of them die at once. So Emma wasn't just like, I lost my husband. I lost my brother. I lost my two most supportive brother-in-laws. And I have to go to these funerals. And now they're wanting to take away my house and have me move out to the middle of nowhere. I'm done. And so the church basically said, look, keep the house. It's his. So he did
Hmm.
live in some degree of comfort, but never really what I would call peace. I mean, he never really
Yeah.
had a luxury, like he just never did. The ultimate goal for any con man, obviously, is to live in some mansion somewhere and be left alone with, and enjoy the spoils of your wealth. He never did that. If that was what his goal was,
Yeah.
he never accomplished it.
Um, yeah, and also a big thing is that so people say, oh, like people have a big problem with polygamy, and but then like also Moses was a polygamist, Solomon, all of these people in the Bible were, and but what's different though is that how could it be okay that Joseph Smith was practicing polygamy when it's illegal at the time? Like that's the difference
So
is that
it
it wasn't legal
so
back
it
then. Now it's legal.
it wasn't technically legal at the time he was doing it. No. So
Okay.
it was the Morel Anti-Bigamy Act, which wasn't passed until after his death, shortly before the turn of the 19th century. The Morel Anti-Bigamy Act is what caused it to become illegal, but that wasn't passed until after Joseph Smith died. But there were local ordinances against cohabitation, true. But Joseph Smith never cohabitated with his wives while he was alone with Emma. That's one of the reasons for the public statement that they're saying that I am married or I have other wives and I cannot find one. So it could have been. So Richard Bushman, in his book Rough Stone Rolling, which I think is one of the best biographies currently of Joseph Smith, in that book, what he does is he kind of analyzes from an objective perspective. Because remember, we don't know what people were thinking. We can only guess what they're thinking. And in order to guess what their motives were, you have to know what they were thinking. Well, unless they specifically tell you and you believe it, you can never know what somebody's thinking. So Joseph Smith believed that he was engaged in what he called plural marriage or spiritual wifery, and he did it for the purposes of combining and unifying the church through a sealing ordinance that bound families together. So it's one of the reasons why one of the younger wives, Helen Mar Kimball, is kind of a big deal to some people because she was about 14. The problem with that is that her father actually supported that sealing, which was never really what we would understand as a marriage. It was more of a unification of the Prophet's family and the Kimball family. So they saw it as we're now bound together in the eternities as a family. And these people, Heber loved Joseph and wanted his family to be unified with the prophet's family. And the way you do that is you
Hmm.
seal people together. But he never cohabitated with her in a marital relationship as we understand it. And it wouldn't have been a marriage where there would have been a marriage certificate filed with the county or something like that. Because they
Yeah.
weren't marriages, they were sealings. And that's one of the problems with people outside of the church is they think that we're splitting hairs and we're not. That like I am sealed to my wife and I am married to her. That is two things. Now I
Hmm.
did them at the same time, but that doesn't change the fact that they are two separate things. I had to fill out a marriage license and file it with the county of records to show that I'm married to her. But I also had to have a temple sealer perform a religious service that we call a sealing, but that's just a church function. That has no legal authority. That's not legally
Well,
binding anywhere.
why would it be called marriage at all then?
Well, they're just using the words interchangeably as they understand them. So people are using marriage, but the church is so people tend to speak imprecisely when they speak and describe things. But what I'm saying is we have to be precise in the way that we speak. Now, there were some of his wives that at some times he did live with briefly and have a sexual relationship with. It's not like he wasn't having sex with any of them, because we do have the testimonies of some of these women after his death who indicated that he did have a full husband wife relationship with them, and that Emma not only knew about it, but was okay with it. So there's that. But as far as like a legal marriage, Joseph Smith was not legally married to these women. He was sealed to them. Now you can call it a marriage, but they were not legal marriages in that sense. He's not going down and filing marriage certificates every time he's doing one of
Hmm.
these, which is why he would say he could honestly tell people, people think that I have all these wives. I only see one. And yes, he's kind of being a little bit fast and loose with the wording, but he's not actually, because in Joseph's mind, he's doing what God commands him. And if he were to go out and publicly say, "Yeah, I have lots of wives," people would not understand the complicated sealing doctrine that's happening in the church. They would just say, "Polygamist." And he's like, look, it's not really what's happening. Now, full polygamy, where you've got men cohabitating with legal wives, doesn't really start until the Utah period with Brigham Young, right? These men aren't
Okay.
really like having these open public marriages until later on in the uh, Utah period, because
And
now
was
you're in a
it, yeah.
territory. Yeah, you're now in a territory. It's outside of federal government control.
Was
Effectively, now they can do whatever they want.
wait, so, but I remember hearing that they like kind of kept plural marriage kind of secretive.
At the very beginning, it wasn't taught publicly, no. But see, neither was Section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants initially. So, so Section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants is the revelation of the degrees of glory. If you read Section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants, even that wasn't publicly revealed for years after it was given, because Joseph was concerned that some of the Latter-day Saints were not ready to accept it. But the idea that something is revealed to somebody and that they don't publicly teach it, or that they don't teach it in clarity, is actually biblically sound, because the Lord did that by teaching parables. So his apostles come to
Yeah,
him and say, "Why do you teach
right,
in parables?" And he says, "Because they seeing see not, and hearing hear not. Therefore I speak unto them in parable." Because they're not
right.
prepared for the deeper mysteries of the kingdom. The idea that, well, and in the Book of Mormon, there's several times during the Lord's ministry in Third Nephi where he actually tells the apostles not to declare things. Moroni, when he's translating the Book of Ether, also is told, "Hey, here's these great mysteries of the kingdom, but I'm going to put them in the Book of Mormon and I'm going to seal them because you don't get to have them yet." So there are truths and mysteries of the kingdom of God we haven't even been told yet. And so the thing is that that is the point of having the expectation that God can talk. My problem, my overwhelming problem with the overwhelming majority of the Christian world is that they and it, just on this principle alone, I have to remain a Latter-day Saint. And I have to remain a Latter-day Saint because we believe God can talk. And I don't know how you can believe in God and then say, but he stopped talking 2,000 years ago. And even in the Catholic Church, in fact, I have a discussion I published in my channel a few days ago of me talking to a Catholic, and this kid is like, "There's no public revelation anymore. There's no more revelation. We have everything we need in the Bible. The church is just authorized to interpret it, and we have tradition, and we have the Pope. So the Pope can make decisions on cultural and social issues, but they're not revelations. There is no more revelation." And how they can believe that God stopped talking because he told us everything we need to know, I just don't understand that. It doesn't ring true to me. Maybe some people can reconcile that, but the reason they do is that they hold on to their Bible, one, because they love the Bible. I love the Bible too. But the biggest issue is that rejecting that God can expand the knowledge of human beings in the same process as is revealed in the Bible, it's just contrary and antithetical to the very text itself. That text talks about how God reveals and how he talks. And it gives us foundational principles in the sense that one of the things I have to do is I have to look at legal precedent. So I have to look at something that happened in the past and see if it has a principle that can be applied today. Well, if I see any evidence, like you said, with polygamy, Moses practiced polygamy. He married other wives. Jacob did. Abraham did. Isaac probably did. Jacob certainly did, right? David did. Solomon did. And he says, well, the wives that they received that taught them to go after other gods, those were mistakes. But polygamy is not condemned in the Bible, but it's also not necessarily something that's like good job. But it is a thing that is culturally acceptable because we see lots of evidence of it. The idea that a man could only have one wife and that that was the only thing that was culturally acceptable, that didn't happen until about 300 years ago. That's
Well,
when
I
people
mean,
started to kind of reject the idea.
I remember my brother saying that it is condemned in the Bible, though. So, do you know what
It's
he's
not.
talking about?
Good luck finding that.
Oh,
Good
well,
luck. He's just,
well, I mean, it
that's the
says
problem.
somewhere that like you should take a wife and you should be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah,
One
yeah,
wife.
well, that's in Genesis. Well, thus shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and the twain shall be one flesh.
Yeah, one
Okay.
flesh, exactly. So like two
Uh-huh.
should become one flesh.
Okay. All right. And then later on, when the Israelites start having multiple wives and they give specific direction in Deuteronomy on how to deal with if a man has more than one wife, here's the rules. What do you do
Well,
about that?
oh, I don't, I, what
That's what I'm
you made me
saying
re
is
well, you
so
what you reminded me of is when Jesus tells or no, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they're like, "Hey, what
in
happens
Matthew
if?"
22. Yeah.
Yeah, they all these brothers basically have this one wife at one time, right?
Mhm.
But it's not like at the same time. It's like after one brother
Oh
dies,
no,
and then
no, yeah, yeah, yeah. So
so
Joe,
it's never
yeah, polygamy is practiced broadly in the ancient world. There were lots of men that had plural wives. It was just,
well,
it would have been, it would just was common. It wouldn't have been weird saying, hey, I've got my wife Maria and I've got my wife Janet and I've got two wives. That wouldn't have been something that would have raised a single eyebrow. Nobody would have cared. And so, in fact, Paul has specific restrictions. It looks like, for example, in the pastoral epistles, it says a bishop has to be the husband of one wife. That doesn't mean
right.
that a bishop has to get married. That means a bishop can only be the husband of one wife. That means that there are men who have more than one wife in the congregation and they're still members of the group. It's just that if you want to be a
Well,
bishop, you can only have one wife.
why then doesn't it say anywhere that like you should be practicing polygamy? Because in the way that I've heard it
It
is that
doesn't.
like
It doesn't say
God
that.
has
Yeah, it doesn't say
polygamy
that.
at
It
certain
just
times.
so it's kind of like this. There are a lot of things that are just taken as a thing and then they are just talked about. They don't have to command one way or another. God's not making a command one way or the other. So Jacob, for example, takes wives. Why?
Because he wants
Because
the other one.
it's just a thing they do. It's not weird. It's like, oh, I had this wife. I got Rachel, and then I got Rebecca, and I've got these wives, and this is just my wives. It wasn't something that he was like, well, and I had to ask God for a specific revelation as to whether it was okay to have more. No, they just did that. That was just part of living. Men could have multiple
Right.
wives. It's just the thing that
Just
they
a
did.
normal
And
practice.
wives didn't think there's anything weird about it. They're just like, yeah, you just, he has already has a wife. He wants to marry me too, and I'm down with it. So that's what we're gonna do.
Right.
I mean, to think that that's
Gotcha.
something that you have to have Like we don't have to have a dialogue about, because remember, revelations from God come in response to problems.
All right,
Or
right,
God has a specific thing he wants you to do. So those are the two main reasons that we have it. We don't have revelations on things that I don't have a question about.
right. Um, yeah.
Now, there are specific laws in Deuteronomy regarding if you take wives from other nations, which is just understood that you're going to do that. If you go and you conquer another nation, you're going to take their women as your wives, even if you already have a wife. Levirate marriage, that's described, I think, in Deuteronomy 25, which is actually what's being addressed by the Sadducees in Matthew 22, actually can require polygamy because it says that if a woman dies not having a child with her husband, she's supposed to marry his brother, right? And then he is
Mhm.
supposed to raise up seed with her to the brother. Where
Mhm.
in there does it say that the brother has to be single?
Right. Yeah,
It
he's
doesn't.
already married, and then
Yeah, what if
you
his
have a
brother's already
wife.
married? Yeah, what if he has six
Right.
brothers that are already remarried and she just marries one of the brothers? He's supposed
Right.
to have children with her, and then the inheritance of the dead brother goes to those children. They're not
Right.
his heirs, they're the heirs of his dead brother. And it's to
Mm.
keep and maintain the family line so that his brother's name doesn't die out. So he performs a function of basically impregnating her and being her new husband. It doesn't matter whether he's married or not. At no point in the text does it say, but only if he's not married already. But it doesn't say that, and if his brother is single, he shall take her. It doesn't say that. So the idea that levirate marriage could lead to plural marriage or polygamy is just a given. And again, there
Right.
is no prohibit. The thing is, it's like God doesn't command it. Okay, well, God doesn't ever reject it.
Mhm.
God never condemns it.
Mhm.
It's just and nobody would ask. It's not like there's rules governing it, how you're supposed to do it. So obviously they're doing it. It's just, but this idea of, oh, monogamy is the way it's supposed to be. No, that's a very modern Christian imposition trying to read that into the text. That's not the way the texts are reading. They just don't
Mhm.
believe that. It's just like people who argue that the Bible is actually teaching proper science. The Bible doesn't teach proper science because it's not a scientific book. Also, if it's scientific, its science is horrible because the Bible reflects that the earth is flat and it has a dome over the top, and that dome has water on top of it, and that
I've
there's
heard that
water
before.
underneath it.
Where is that? Because I feel like I've never
Oh,
seen that.
it's like any time it talks about the earth, it's like it starts in Genesis. If you look about it, this is the Genesis creation story in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the land and the sky.
Uh-huh.
Okay? And he did that by dividing the water from below from the water from above. And he placed a firmament
Oh,
over the earth.
yeah.
A
Hmm.
firmament is like a dome. And let me tell you this. This is what you've got to do. So when you're talking to your family, take off your I'm a 21st century educated person and put on your I'm a primitive person who is scared of the dark because there's
Hmm.
no technology, there's no light, there's no science, there's no germ theory, there's no engineering, there's no principles of mathematics. These are ancient people who are scared of the lightning. And when it
Hmm.
gets dark, it is dark. You've never experienced dark the way that these
Oh,
people
yeah.
experience dark. Yeah. The light from the stars was very important to them. The light from the moon was very important to them because
Yeah.
they didn't have anything but a torch, right? There was
Mhm.
no lamps and yeah. So in that world, whenever they had thunder, they got scared. In fact, the reason that these mountains were often seen as the place of God because they had storms that were going on up there. And they're like, ooh, it's the gods having a meeting. That is no different for the Israelites. They're not exempted from that perspective. They still have those same problems. They're afraid of the weather, they're afraid of fire, they're concerned about death. If somebody gets a toothache, they die because an abscessed tooth was actually one of the number one causes of death back then. So it's just if you got an like where you needed a root canal, you're probably going to die
Wow.
because there's nothing they can do for it other than pull the tooth. And if they don't catch it in time, you're going to die. You'll get an abscess in your jaw, it'll go into your bloodstream, and you'll be dead. So people died of toothaches. So this is the world we're talking about. We're not talking about a world where this is a world where I'm a man, and if I can take your shit, I'm just going to take it. That's the world.
Hmm.
Like I'm stronger than you. I have a bigger army. Look at the thing with Lot and Abraham when the people come in and they raise an army and they're fighting back and forth over stuff. I mean, people kind of view Abraham as this super sophisticated guy. These guys pulled swords and killed people. They killed their neighboring tribes. These guys knew how to fight. They had weapons. They knew how to cut people's heads off. They knew how to butcher animals. They knew stuff that you've never even thought about knowing. Like, do you know how to field dress a cow? No. You've never done it. You wouldn't know how to butcher a lamb if you'd have to be taught. It would be weird to you. These guys could do things and they'd think you're a wuss. So,
Hmm.
but on the flip side, they'd be scared of a mosquito because they know that if you get bit by a mosquito, you can die. And you'd be like, no, you'll
Right.
be fine. Right. So
Yeah.
it's this balancing act of we've learned things, but we've also forgotten things that they knew. But the ancient world, so when you're reading the biblical text, you've got to take off your modern understanding and think about the way you've
Yeah.
seen ancient primitive people depicted in like a movie. They're not like
Mhm.
if you watch these old Viking movies where they're like, they're stabbing each other with sticks and beating their heads in with rocks and they're and we take the women and we drag them back with us and they're just ours now. That's the world they lived in. And to think that they were sophisticated Christians, which is what a lot of people think, is stupid because they weren't.
Mhm.
Now they were trying to be better, and God was trying to help them be better, but it's not like God just went to Moses and said, and now you're sophisticated and modern. No. What does
Mhm.
he do? He goes to Moses and says, here's this law. And what does Moses find him doing? Worshiping a golden cow. I mean,
Golden
they
calf.
get
Yeah.
scared. They get scared because Moses is gone for a few days, and they build a cow and start worshiping it. Does that sound like smart people who are comfortable with being alone? Yeah. These are primitive people. And so this idea of they're sophisticated and they would be grossed out by things and they would ask really sophisticated questions and their society was so polite and kind and stuff. They have rules of how to know whether a woman was raped or not. Like if she's
Hmm.
out in the field and she cries if she's assaulted out in the field and she doesn't cry out, then the man is responsible. But if she's raped in the city and nobody hears her cry out, then she's a consensual actor and she's responsible too. Who comes up with a law like that?
Yeah.
Right? That's what God came up with. That's how he told people how to decide whether a woman was raped consensually or not. Right? Like if she doesn't scream, then she's a willing participant. But if you're out in the country, then the guy just raped her.
Right. Yeah. Um. Um. So what? One of the first things that I kind of had a problem with it was is that in the story where Moses saw God, right? He only saw his back, and just from seeing his back, his face is shining, right? And you said like that no man can see God without dying, right? And so how
So
does Smith see God and his face isn't even shining? He sees his face and he's just normal,
yeah,
you know?
so that is a problem of a claim for people making that claim because who's the God talking?
Who's what?
Who's the God?
God is the God of Abraham?
Who's yeah, who is that?
Mm. You're losing me. I don't know.
So
The
the
same God,
God that
right?
appears. So if you read Exodus chapter 3, Moses
Yeah.
sees a burning bush, right?
Yeah.
you're aware that in the text he doesn't just see a burning bush, but there's a man standing above the fire in the
Yeah.
bush.
Yeah.
Okay. Who's that man?
Jesus.
We actually don't know, but it's probably God.
Okay.
Well, is it Jesus?
I feel like it would be Jesus. Yeah.
Okay, let's go with that. And I think that most Protestants would probably agree with you that, well, some people actually say it's a theophany, meaning it is an angel that has God's authority. That's how they
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
get around it, right?
In the same
Because
way,
that
like,
person is that person's seeing God. Then I don't recall the exact passage, but um, it's in Numbers where anyway God is actually kind of chiding Aaron and um, telling him that there are people who can speak to me who are able to receive my word, but Moses is special in my house. With Moses, I talk face to face as one man talks to another. And some people say, oh, well, that's not. So what they do is they take a passage that says nobody can see my face and live, and another passage where God says that I talk to Moses face to face, right? And they prefer one over the other rather than
mhm,
accepting that there was a change of circumstances or I don't know what. They just
mhm,
say, well, you can't see God. He was speaking figurative. Okay, but that's not what he said. So the idea that this is figurative and this is not, or this is literal and this is not, or whatever they come up with, they're still left with a conundrum. And so the problem with it is it talks about how Moses is special in my house. With him, I will talk face to face. And so God will talk to Moses face to face in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, near the Ark of the Covenant. So if they're having this experience, even in those, even the text that Moses is allegedly writing, there is a problem because he himself is actually identifying, I can't see God's face, but I can talk to him face to face. Elijah, or in Genesis, Jacob talks to God face to face in Peniel because he says, I spoke with the Lord face to face and my life is preserved. So the way that some people will reconcile that is they will say anytime they're talking to God face to face, they're talking to an angel. But that's not what the text says, right? So what they're doing is they're using a Christian interpretative lens because they're trying to say no man can see God, but men do see God. And so what I'm going to do is anytime it says he did see God, I'm going to come up with an explanation that reconciles the two. You see what I'm saying?
mhm,
But that reconciliation is not explained in the text. That reconciliation is you reading a reconciliation into the document that's not there, right?
mhm,
Because the other issue is this, even more simply. The God that is apparently nobody can see his face is Jesus.
mhm.
So work that out in your head.
Wait, say that one more time.
The God that
Mhm.
Moses can't see is Jesus.
Oh, right. Yeah, that doesn't.
So how does that work with the apostles when he appears to them resurrected and fully
Right.
glorified?
Right.
And they thought that he was a spirit because of his glory or whatever. And then he appears to Paul on the road to Damascus. I've actually had people argue that Paul didn't actually see Jesus because he was God, right?
Mhm.
And
Oh,
it's like, except that that would mean that Paul is not actually a witness to the resurrection. He's just a witness to Jesus's voice or a light. But in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, I saw Christ. I saw
right.
his raised, resurrected body. So if no man can see God, and Jesus is that God, and Jesus is seen by many people after the fact, how do you work that out in your head?
Yeah, and also
And
because
so the way that they
people,
do it, they say,
yeah.
well, the incarnation. Okay, there's a problem there too, because in John chapter 1, it says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the
Hmm.
beginning with God. So that identifies two gods. One of them is the Word, and one of them is the Father. Jesus clarifies that in John 20, in the same text. Tells Mary in John 20, I go to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God, thus identifying himself as the pre incarnate Word, but also God with his Father. In John 17, he identifies himself as praying to his Father and telling his Father to return to me the glory which I had with you before the world was. I've condescended to leave that glory behind. And when I will be glorified again, glorify me after I've accomplished my mission, right?
Hmm.
Hebrews talks about him being super exalted. Philippians chapter 2 talks about him being fully exalted to become what the Father is, that he is like the Father, right? So basically, Jesus does one of these. He comes down, he leaves the glory, comes down, and then goes back to a higher glory. So we couldn't see him at this glory, but we can see him at this one.
Oh, right.
So
Right.
then they say, okay, I see your point. Well, now the passage is talking about his father,
Hmm.
not him.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
they're the same
Yeah.
being,
Hmm. Yep.
right? You see, they're so
It's a
the better
loop.
theology is this. This is how a Latter-day Saint would reconcile it. Unless you're in a state of spiritual preparation and God actually changes you to be able to withstand his glory will kill you. But God
Hmm.
has the ability to transfigure you to survive his glory if you are in a state of spiritual preparation.
Hmm.
And he can do that because the power of Christ's atonement allows us to be brought back into the presence of God and survive his glory. And let
Hmm.
me give you a clear example of that happening. After Adam partakes of the fruit, he falls, and yet he is brought back into the presence of God and converses with him like one man talking to another and is not destroyed. Why? Because the effect of the atonement kicked in, and God is able to transfigure Adam in some way to survive his glory. Now, the way
Wait,
they
when
would
is that?
reconcile that's in Genesis. That's just in Genesis.
Genesis where? Oh
It's
well,
in Genesis chapter
what is like
3.
context? What is he talking about?
It's in Genesis chapter 3, right after they eat the fruit. So
Oh,
Adam
okay.
and Eve are walking and
When
talking
he's
with God, and then afterwards, God comes down and he's like, "Where are you?" And they're like, "We went and hid ourselves because we ate the fruit and
right.
we were naked." Oh, okay. But they're able to survive coming back into the presence and talking to God.
Uh-huh.
How?
Right.
And
Through the
that
atonement.
God is that God Jesus or is that God the Father? Because
Uh-huh.
this is what I'm saying, Matthew. These questions, when they try to say, no man can see God and Joseph Smith saw God. No, no, little man. That analysis is complicated. That is not just a no man can see God because this one verse says so. If you want to believe that, you have a whole bunch of problems you have to reconcile because the Bible has this like changing, you know, litmus test of when men can see God and now they can't, and now they can, and now they can't, right? And trying to
Hmm.
make them all work out, good luck. And so, if you're going to develop a theology that describes it, that's fine. But that theology is not explained anywhere in the Bible. And so, if you've got one, that's fine. Where did you get it? For Latter day Saints, do you know where we got the idea that a man can be transfigured to survive the presence of God? It was revealed to Joseph Smith
Hmm.
because he asked that question. I don't understand. How come some passages say you can see him and some passages say you can't? And God says, well, sometimes I'm pissed off at the person I'm talking to and they're not spiritually prepared. And if I were to show my glory to them, they'd be destroyed. Other times they're in a state of spiritual humility and I can change them so they'll survive my presence.
Hmm.
Because you know what? God,
Right.
right?
Okay. That
And to
that
think and
makes
to
sense.
think that God, like my other issue with it is think about the bigger problem. God can't make you survive talking to him. Really?
Right. Hmm. Wait,
God creates you,
lost you.
but he
Hmm.
can't make it where you can talk to him because you'll be destroyed. Really? Are you saying he's
Yeah.
not omnipotent? Because they believe he's omnipotent and he can do whatever he wants, but he can't make it where humans can survive talking to him. Okay,
Right.
sure, that makes sense. You see, that's
Yeah.
what I don't. So this is what you've got to do. Whenever they kind of pose these problems, you've got to, even if you don't have the tools to question it now, this is why I like discussions with people like you that are open-minded and are actually kind of trying to examine these things. Most people I talk
Hmm.
to are really fundamentalist and like, I don't care what you say, the Bible alone is God's word, and I'm not going to listen to you. All I'm going to say is the Bible says this, and that's what it says. But when you're open-minded, you're willing to say, I read this passage and it seems to say this. What do you think? And how does it work
Yeah.
out?
Exactly.
Honest, the Bible's full of so much stuff that seems to contradict and be inconsistent with itself. But see, from your probably your family's perspective, they can't accept that idea. The Bible has to be consistent throughout. Every writer agrees with every other writer, and that
Hmm.
belief is absurd because they
Right.
don't. This is not a book that was written by one guy. This is 66 or more books all combined together from different people across different time periods, talking to different audiences for different reasons, and then they stuck them all together. And then to think that all of them are going to agree with each other, well, that's dumb.